Welcome to the Golf Improvement Podcast, episode 77.
Welcome to the podcast for golf lovers and enthusiasts who are looking to take their games to new heights. Dedicated to custom club fitting, short game improvement, and effective practice to improve your golf game. This is the Golf Improvement Podcast with your host, Tony Wright.
Hello, this is Tony Wright from Game Improvement Golf in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, with the Golf Improvement Podcast, dedicated to bringing you useful information on custom club fitting, short game improvement, and effective practice techniques to take your game to new heights. I looked up the definition of the word review this morning, and that word means a formal assessment or examination of something with the possibility or intention of instituting change if necessary. Well, in my view, this is exactly what Russ Ryden from Fit to Score Golf and Golf Shaft Reviews is doing with his work to evaluate the properties of golf shafts and to use this knowledge to understand how golf shafts perform for golfers and also for custom fitters, for true custom fitters who are helping golfers to play their best golf. The change, in my view, is about helping all of us change what we think we know about golf shafts. So I hope you enjoy this interview with Russ Ryden from Fit to Score Golf and Golf Shaft Reviews as much as I did. Hello, this is Tony Wright with the Golf Improvement Podcast. And today I'm excited to interview a good friend, Russ Ryden, who's the owner of Fit to Score, a Dallas-Fort Worth golf club fitting and building company. He's been a club fitter for more than 10 years. He's one of the first people to use flight scope in his club fitting work. He has been named one of America's 100 best club fitters by Golf Digest magazines a number of times, 2011, 13, I think in 15 also. And he's the creator of a really interesting website called Golf Shaft Reviews. And I think the number is, somewhere more than 1 million people have accessed that site. Isn't that right, Russ? I don't know what the number is now.
We're over 1 million now. It's been up since 2015.
Yeah.
So
that's pretty big in the world of web access. It
took a little while to get there.
Yeah.
And people just slowly discover us, and 35% of the people that have ever been on the site come back for more.
Well, that's a pretty good indicator of what's on there. So we're going to talk a lot about driver golf shafts today, a little, in general golf shafts, but, in particular, some things about driver golf shafts and the properties of golf shafts, the material properties of them. But Russ, as we start out, why don't you talk a little bit about what got you interested in custom club fitting at the start, and then how you first realized you needed to measure material properties of golf shafts?
Well, Tony, I love the game. Took it up late in life, and I'm a gear geek, so the engineer in me made me want to know everything I could about the equipment I was playing with. And at first I was taken in, as most are, by the golf club company marketing propaganda, like this will be longer, this will be straighter, this will be easier, all those terms.
Yeah.
And I realized the only place to learn about golf clubs was at golf club building schools and organizations. And that's probably where we first met, at the PCS.
I think we met at the AGCP also.
Yeah. And, and it was at one of that first PCS meeting that I went to that I met a guy named Jerry Hofling, and he introduced me to understanding golf shafts by measuring their properties. And, and I was intrigued by this stuff, and it got my interest. And, after a year or two of working with his system, first I copied his system and kind of rewrote it on my own. And then I decided to move on and create my own.
It's kind of interesting, and you're going to get deeper into that as we talk. But before we go any further, let's look at it from the the golfer's standpoint. What are some of the most typical misconceptions that golfers have about golf shafts and their designs from your knowledge and from the kinds of things that you've learned actually?
Well, the typical golfer has learned about golf shafts by reading golf shaft company marketing materials. And they look at the stiffness letters on the shaft, and really they don't have any clue at all about how that golf shaft is going to work in their hands. And as an example, I had a call yesterday from a reader of golf shaft reviews about what shaft would be best for him. And he kept using the term kick point to ask me about shafts. And it causes me to think a little bit about that. That term kick point, it goes back to Ralph Maltby at GolfWorks.
And you and I talked about this a couple months ago. You asked me to kind of look into that, if I remember, right?
Yeah. And I had to pull out the book and look at it again. And Ralph measured deflection with a deflection board. And he would measure the shaft. He would clamp the tip and load the butt, and then he would turn the shaft around and clamp the butt and load the tip. And where those 2 points intersected, he defined as kick point. Well, we have to think back. This was 40 years ago. Ralph had primitive measuring tools in his day when he taught golf club fitters those terms. And today we have better instruments, and from them we get a more in-depth and better understanding of golf shaft bending. We know more about shafts now than we did 40 years ago. But those terms, kick point, linger.
bend point, and all those kind of things, right?
Yeah. They're stuck in the minds of golfers, and I think it's probably because they're easy to understand.
Well, it's also, too, because, I think some of the companies still use those terms. This shaft has a high kick point and things like that, or low, right? I mean, you'll see those things around.
It's still out there, but when I sit down and talk to the actual shaft engineers, those words don't even come up.
Yeah. Well, it's good. We can knock that one out, right?
Well, they're going to be with us for a while.
Yeah.
You just have to have that discussion with the golfer about shafts are so much more complicated now than they ever were.
Yeah.
That you can lay up the carbon fiber in different ways. You can use different fibers. You look at today's golf shaft. You've got different kinds of materials in different areas. You've got different fiber orientations, different fiber strengths, different fiber weights, and even when we get into steel, what's going on now? And one of the companies kind of alluded to it, but they didn't actually verify. But I believe that they're doing what I call induction annealing, and that they are changing the properties of the steel by tempering it at different points in the shaft. It used to be that you would draw it and you would temper it as you were drawing it, but there is something called induction heating. And I think that by using induction heating now, they're actually annealing the shafts differently in different places. If you remember back to the Royal Precision days, those tips of the rifles were bimetallic. They had different materials in them to create those different kind of properties. We don't have to do that anymore. There's induction annealing out there now. And even in steel, which you would consider a monomer, we've got different kind of properties available. So, all of those properties combine into shafts that don't have one bend point or kick point anymore. You can tailor the bend point, the kick point. Yeah, there I go. I'm using the words, right?
Yeah, right. You can tailor the way the shaft performs, is what you really mean.
Well, when we first started looking at EI profiles, we called them hinges. How many hinges did a shaft have?
Yeah. 2,
3, 4, right? When did it change properties? When did it change bend throughout the shaft?
Well, that's a nice segue into the next question, because of from the standpoint, then we're sort of bringing golfers up little by little into some of the things right? What are some of maybe the top 3 or 4 shaft properties that you measure, and a little bit about why they're important?
Well, it's a long list, actually. I measure EI, I measure torque, I measure weight, I measure hoop strength, I measure balance, I measure consistency. But, let's start at the top about what we were just talking about, EI. EI is an engineering term used to describe stiffness of a beam. And it gets used by engineers when they're designing buildings and bridges and almost everything.
It's the part I hated the most about engineering. The whole stress. I have to admit that, but still, I know it's important. But I was a fluids guy, So, but anyhow.
Yeah. So when we look at that word EI, E stands for elasticity of the material, and I, in its simplest terms, is the cross section of the material. So you combine the stiffness with the cross section, and you have the bend properties. And it gets a bit complicated in golf shafts because E isn't constant. It changes based upon what we were just talking about, annealing or fiber layup or, fiber strength. And the I, of course, the cross-section, that changes as well because cross-section is changing with the inner and outer diameter of wall thickness of the shaft.
Yeah.
So that one's moving around too. So we can't just say that this shaft has a particular bend profile. It's going to change based upon the EI. And so the only thing we can really do in golf shafts is to measure EI. We can't, a shaft engineer, of course, he has the ability to sort these two things out. But when we're looking at the shaft that gets delivered to us, what we can measure is this thing called EI. And we do that by measuring a section of the shaft, and I take a 10-inch section of the shaft, and I measure it inch by inch, and we can then chart the EI along the length of that shaft. And from that, we get an image of how that shaft bends. And from those images, we can develop an understanding of how changing shafts is going to change ball flight and what we call feel. So let me give you an example. In a recent interview with Kim Braley, we were discussing a new shaft he's about to release.
And Kim is the guru of KBS shafts for those.
For those that don't know, Kim Braley is the KB in KBS golf, KBS shafts, right?
Yeah.
And he was telling me a story. He was telling me that many tour players like to feel that he didn't have in his current model matrix. And I asked him to use his hand to draw that EI curve in the air. And he looked at me, and I said to him, "Go ahead, I can see him." And he drew the curve with his hand, and I knew instantly how that new shaft was going to feel. And I knew the gap that it filled in his current product line. And I know how many guys on tour are playing that profile.
Yeah.
And he didn't have it, right? So EI curves, they're the language of shaft engineers, and they should be the language of club fitters and golfers. So when a good ball striker says to me he doesn't like the feel of a shaft we're testing, I know immediately which shaft is going to provide a feel that he's going to like, or at least I know which shaft might solve the problem that he's telling me about.
You got a reasonable chance of picking an option that can get him where he's going.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this conversation could go on all day, but we know from inch by inch EI that we can calculate many other properties of the shaft. So let's go back to Maltby for a second. That total bending under load that he was doing, when we can take those EI sectional measurements and we can just add them up with a particular load, and we can calculate how much a shaft will bend when loaded at the tip or when loaded at the butt, or how much it will bend for a particular amount of load. So, we can take those two curves and intersect them, and there it is. We have Ralph's kick point. So don't come away from this thinking that I'm endorsing kick point.
You can just get it. That's all. What you're saying, right?
We can calculate it. Once we've got the EI numbers, we can calculate a whole bunch of stuff. And, it goes back to that point that there's so much more going on in today's designs. So next on my list of properties is torque. And every manufacturer uses a different method for measuring torque. They clamp 2 inches from the tip, or 1 inch from the tip, or 3 inches from the tip.
Yeah, right.
Right.
Yeah.
And they clamp the butt at different places. And so most of what you see, it has meaning inside of a particular brand, but when you move outside of that brand, it's meaningless. So I measure torque with the same system for every shaft. And we can have shafts with exactly the same bend profiles, but vastly different torque profiles. And, that's where I see the difference between bargain shafts that claim to have exactly the same profile as some premium tour quality aftermarket shaft. And every time I hear somebody claim that some bargain shaft is just as good, there'll be a little smile on my face, right? Torque is a factor in keeping the head aligned with your hands when you're trying to deliver the golf club to a ball. And high torque creates dispersion and inconsistency. And so, it's important to understand not only how a shaft is going to bend, but how a shaft is going to twist. And it's there that we can see a huge difference in shaft quality.
Yeah.
And then, another metric, and this one's a little new to me, is hoop strength. Now, hoop strength is about how much a shaft flattens or goes out of round when it bends. And what we learned about 2 years ago was that hoop deformation is a factor in actually developing EI measurements. And that's a very long topic that we're not going to go into today.
And I remember when that was going on.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so at this point, hoop for me is an unknown element in dispersion. Fujikura, if you remember back to the speeders, started this conversation a long time ago. And I just started measuring hoop deformation about 18 months ago, and we now have enough data on shafts that we're going to go out this summer and test dispersion on shafts that have different amounts of hoop deformation. The last 18 months, we spent a lot of time remeasuring a lot of the shafts that were in the database. This year, we're going to spend a lot of time trying to understand how hoop strength affects feel and performance from a human perspective.
It's going to be fun.
Yeah.
Now,
the pros I work with are, they're all really getting involved in this kind of stuff. They love doing this testing because along the way, they learn more about shafts than they ever thought they were going to know.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to preface this next question by, I don't think I said it in any of the questions, but besides golf shaft reviews, you offer, a much more detailed description of all of the measurements you have. Okay. And one of the things that really is one of my high value interests is, sometimes you can fit somebody in a shaft and then you buy it and it just doesn't seem to be that same shaft. Okay. And so knowing sort of the metrics of golf shafts, in terms of consistency, and do you get what you expect you're getting, and things like that, is really important. So, as you're measuring properties, you're coming up with metrics for qualities of golf shafts, and can you talk about that a little bit, and why that should be important to golfers and fitters? That's a long-winded intro to that question, isn't it? But there you go.
Yeah, simply put, I look for consistency. And there's a couple reasons that I do this. First, is a shaft round? And, as I came up in club building and learned about it, there was all this talk about spining and spine alignment and all of these processes for finding a shaft spine. Well, by and large, shafts don't have spines. When you look at how shafts are rolled out in carbon fiber and how many times they're drawn in steel, in steel, whatever weld was there, by the time it's pulled through the 10th set of dies, it's gone a long time ago. In carbon fiber, you're having multiple wraps put on. Well, to think that there is one point of overlap on all of those wraps, mean, it just doesn't exist. So, what is it about roundness that we can measure? Well, given what we're willing to pay for a golf shaft, they're not exactly round. They're all elliptical to some degree or another. And this was this concept of spine, but you have to look at it a little differently. If a shaft isn't round, if it's going to be an ellipse, it's going to have a long side of the ellipse and it's going to have a short side of the ellipse. And on those two sides are going to have different stiffness. And the simplest way to do that is actually with a frequency machine. And you find what's called flatline oscillation, and you just measure the frequency at that plane. Then you turn the shaft 90 degrees, and you go looking for the other side of that ellipse, and you measure the stiffness over there. So now you know the hard side and the soft side of that shaft, and you want to have those two sides be very, very close to each other on your frequency machine. When they are, then you have a shaft that's essentially round. And if it's essentially round, it doesn't have to be aligned. If you have a shaft that has a large difference in stiffness, hard side to soft side, there's no alignment that's going to fix that shaft. That means when that shaft is at the horizon in your downswing and the toe is pointing up, you're on, let's say, the hard side. And when you get to impact, you've rotated that shaft 90 degrees and you're on the soft side. Do you really want to play with a shaft that's like an R flex at the horizon and an S flex at impact?
Probably not. I mean,
Probably not.
That was one thing that I absorbed almost immediately. I mean, every time I take a shaft, I'm always measuring to see I write down what that delta of frequency is.
Yeah. And if it's more than 2,
if
it's more than 2, it'll never get out on tour.
Yeah.
If it's more than 5, it shouldn't have come out of the factory. It should have been thrown away. Now, again, we get into this quality issue of when you have a high reject ratio, obviously your expense goes up. If you paint those shafts and ship them, your manufacturing cost is down and your sale cost is down. So, we see, I've seen some garbage.
Yeah.
And I know how to find it.
Yeah.
Right? Now, the second aspect of this consistency stuff is what I call shaft-to-shaft bend profile. And there's two parts to this. The first is, if I'm just looking at driver shafts, I look at a matrix of shafts from a manufacturer, and I'm going to have a 50-gram RSX, a 60-gram RSX, a 70-gram SX, maybe an 80-gram XX. So I've got a matrix of 10 shafts. So when I'm out there fitting, I want to know that in that matrix of shafts, if I've got the guy in a 60R and I'm thinking, no, maybe I need to move him into the 60S, I don't want that next shaft to have a different bend profile. I want the bend profiles of all those shafts to be consistent. So yes, they're getting stiffer as they're getting heavier, but I know as I move from that 50X to that 60S that I've got the same shaft. That it's not a different bend profile. And so that's a very, very important aspect of consistency. And when I measure shafts, people say, well, do you want 2 of each stiffness? And I say, no, I want 1 of each stiffness because that's all I'm going to measure. I'm not going to go back and remeasure another shaft because the first one I measured was out of sync with the rest of that set.
Yeah. So
I want to know that I can measure one set of shafts and they're all going to be the same.
Yeah, because you never know unless what you're going to do at the end of when you bought another shaft is go through and measure the entire profile again to be sure it was what it was. That doesn't do anything. Right.
If I can see consistency in a matrix of 10 shafts, 1 of each weight and stiffness, I know that when I buy a shaft from that company, it's essentially the same shaft as the shaft I fit with.
Yeah, that's an awesome value of what you're doing in in the things that you're doing with profiling.
And that number is in Golf Shaft Reviews, and you just have to read that number closely.
Well, we'll come back to Golf Shaft Reviews.
Yeah.
Well,
and then there's another aspect to that. As a builder, when you build a set of irons, you want to know that every shaft in that set, 3-iron, 4-iron, 5-iron, 6-iron, 7-iron, all have the same bend profiles. And and if they don't, then you're going to have an 8-iron with a bump in it or something like that. It's going to feel different. It's going to fly different. It's going to be out of sync with that set. It's not just measuring butt frequency on shafts. You have to look at that shaft. If somebody wants me to certify a set of shafts, I'm going to measure that shaft every 2 inches. Every shaft in that set, every 2 inches, and know that they are consistent.
That was
after a while, you don't have to do that because you know which companies deliver consistency.
Yeah.
And you also know which companies don't deliver consistency. And it's just not worth using those shafts that aren't consistent.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because when you're sitting there with 8 shafts and you got to build a set of clubs and 2 of them are off, you got to get more shafts shipped in. Now you're a week late. So that's consistency.
Yeah, that's a great description of it. Well, I asked you to describe your biggest eureka moments, or maybe one or two of you've had in terms of expanding your knowledge about shafts, but you called them aha moments. So go ahead and talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, aha moment. I remember a college course where we had to read a book called The Aha Moment, and it was about the discovery process, and that book is always stuck in my mind. It was about research.
Yeah.
And, learning about driver shafts has been a really slow, tedious process of learning what golfers feel and how they react to what I see in bend profiles. But the aha moment came when I saw that first few sets of EI shaft profiles. Before that, I'd been using a different profiling method to know shafts, and I'd worked through a number of instrument designs to actually get one that worked, and the charts of EI profiles started to emerge. And it was at that moment that I had that was the aha moment. And at that time, I was involved with maybe 6 other fitters, and we were all looking at this stuff at the same time. And when we saw that first set of EI charts, we all abandoned the other profiling system that we had been using. We just looked at it and all agreed that it was a waste of time. It didn't have the resolution, and there was so much more information on the EI charts that we stopped measuring frequency and we never looked back. So that was the moment.
Yeah.
On the fitting side, you have that moment, those moments come kind of in small doses. And I can remember one time fitting some gorilla of a ball striker, and he told me he could feel the head moving around and that the shaft wasn't stable coming into impact. I'm thinking, okay, well, I know which shafts have tighter tips. So I pulled out a white Diamana, knowing that it had a stiffness bump in the mid-tip region, screwed it into the head, and after 2 swings, he turned to me and he said, "That's better." And it's at moments like that when you realize not only that you know what you know, but you know what you're doing, and you know how to make, you know how to fix the problem.
You know how to make informed choices when you're doing your fittings. Right.
I guess the words I'm looking for is that you know why you're doing what you're doing.
That's got to be even better. Yeah. Well, you sort of segued into this too, Russ, because you did mention about, you didn't really say it in these words, but sort of different classes of shafts. And I've heard you talk a couple times about what you view as different classes of driver shafts, and maybe talk about, I think it's 3 or 4, or maybe just 3 that you in general see in terms of the things that you're working with. The shafts that have good consistency, right? And a really a tight bend profile.
Yeah. My understanding of driver shafts is ever evolving. So at any moment in time when you talk to me, there might have been a new idea that came up. But at the moment, I can see generally 3 classes of shafts, and I call them mid-firm, mid-soft, and then there's this new one called super mid-soft. So let's start with mid-soft. When I think of mid-soft, I think of the Mitsubishi Diamante Blue Board, and it's the most copied design ever. And you can say mid-soft in different ways. If people don't like the word soft, maybe you use butt firm, tip firm, but it's the same thing, right?
Yeah.
And that particular design is out there from every shaft company in some form or another. Probably fits 65% of the golfing public. And as a fitter, it's always my starting point in a fitting session. And for many, the fitting session kind of ends right there. Not actually, because, once you see that that's a good fit for the golfer, then you just move on to finding the right weight, stiffness of that profile. But then, there's that other, there's that other guy who has that, that late hard release style in his swing. And there you need that second class of shafts that I call mid-firm. And, those come in a lot of different variations, but, they don't have that depression and softness in the center.
Yeah.
They may be butt soft. They may be, the tips may curve up. The tips may curve down. So you can adjust the flighting with the tip. You can respond to differences in feel by giving him something butt hard or giving him something butt soft, and they react to that. But you have to know those. I mean, in that class of shafts, and there's a lot of shafts out there like that, there's variations on that design. And then there's this new class of shafts. I call it super mid-soft. And I think Fuji was first. But it's now showing up in some other designs. And, there's a new group of shafts out from Aldo right now called the Aldo Elites. And, they've got your typical slightly mid-soft design. They've got your mid-stiff design. And then they've got the Aldo Elite Orange. And that's one of these super mid-soft shafts. And, we also had the Project X loading zone shafts, which has now evolved into the Project X hazardous yellow shaft. And I see that as another one of these super mid-soft designs. And, I have some ideas about why it works, but I can't say that I completely understand it yet. But if you find somebody that fits into a soft mid-shaft, then, once you find his weight and his stiffness, then you should try a super mid-soft and see how he reacts to it. Because I've seen it like instantly add 10 to 15 yards to somebody's driver's distance. And it's, it's a big surprise as a fitter to see a shaft have that kind of effect on distance.
It's very unusual. Yeah, right.
Right?
Yeah.
You don't see that. It's so rare, but I've seen it happen a couple times now. And so, there's one of the pros that I work with that has he has a negative angle of attack on his swings. And this shaft just nails it for him. We took him from he's dropping balls at around 310.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden we've got him out there around 325, 330. You don't want to be too close to him when he's hitting balls because you need earplugs.
Yeah.
From the impact sounds. But this design seems to add something to launch without significantly adding to spin. And one of my projects for this season is to test more people with negative angle of attacks and see when and why this design actually works.
You got any idea why all of a sudden this seemed to emerge? I mean,
I have some ideas, and I've heard some stories, and let's just say that I think Alex D. at Fujikura, with all of the science that he has available to him in that Enzo lab, was one of the first people to recognize it.
Yeah.
It might have been out there by chance in some other people, but I think it was, the research that came out of the Enzo lab that when somebody is saying to me, I've seen shaft designs that can add 7 miles an hour of ball speed.
It's kind of crazy, yeah.
You have to go look at his designs and see what it is he's doing now in his designs to know where that's coming from.
Yeah. Wow. Well, let's, Russ, if you will, talk a little bit about maybe one driver fitting success story that you most often like to tell people.
I always say driver fitting is an art. There's some science involved, but it's going to remain an art for as long as I can see. And I work among very, very talented teaching pros, and one of them very simply stated why fitting will never become formula-based. He said the first thing he looks at in a fitting is the golfer's skill set. His grip, his posture, his rotational range, his swing plane, all of those things that a swing coach with years of experience sees. And he says the idea that you can fit by looking at swing speed or tempo or release is just simply a lack of understanding of the complexity of the golf swing and the range of swing styles that can be successful. Not everybody swings the same.
Yeah.
And there's not one swing that's going to work for everybody. But, you have to look at all of those things, and you just can't, I know that there are a bunch of people out there trying to promote formula-based systems. I just don't see where it's ever going to work.
Yeah. Yeah, we're all unique.
Yeah. So, let's put that aside for a second and go back to your original question, a fitting success story. And, this is an interesting story because many years ago, a friend sent somebody into me for a fitting, and, it turns out the guy is one of the top golf biomechanical PhDs in the business. Not a great ball striker. And his delivery of the golf club head showed me what I call a fishhook on a flight scope acceleration display. And the advice at the time, and this was 5 or 6 years ago or more, was when you saw a fishhook, increase shaft stiffness. And so, I'm increasing his shaft stiffness, and his fishhook is getting worse. And so I finally thought, well, this isn't working. So I put him back and the shaft stiffness and weight that I know is recommended for his speed, and started taking weight out of the head in 2 gram increments. And I had heads at the time where I could pop the weights out of, and this is some years ago, so
yeah,
those heads aren't even made anymore. And the fishhook went away, and his dispersion group tightened up. Now, I was trained in human testing in college, and part of that training is that if you have a concept, you have to give it to another lab, and they have to validate. So I called up my friend John Taylor, who's a real scientist, and he understands this concept of independent lab validation, and I told him the procedure, and he called me back in a few days, and he said he could see the same effect in changing the delivery of the club head with as little as 1 gram. Now, this is years ago.
Yeah.
And so last week, actually a few days ago, I'm fitting a scratch golfer who's a former college player with the Titleist fitting cart. And Titleist now has weights available in their fitting kit. And you can change the weight of the driver head or the weight of the fairway head almost instantly, right? You just take the wrench and pull a weight out, shove another one in, and put a cap back on it. So here it is, 6-7 years later, that concept of weight fitting is now validated in the Titleist fitting cart.
They're watching somebody, right?
Well,
doing it.
They're working with pros. They're they're experimenting with the idea. I mean, you see shaft head weights moving up in the world. And so now we're up around 204 to 206 grams in a lot of shafts, in a lot of heads, excuse me.
Yeah, right.
But we're also seeing like take TaylorMade, for example. That those M2s, they weigh 200 grams. That M1 weighs 205.5 grams. What's that all about?
It's sure a big difference, too.
Yeah, it's a big number.
Yeah, huge.
Now, I know that the M2s that go out on tour get 4 grams of hot melt stuck in a toe. Okay? Yeah. So they take that 202 and they move it up to 204. Now, what is it that they found about the M2 and the average golfer, which is a target for that, where he should have a 200-gram head weight?
Yeah.
So this goes back to that, that fitting success that I had years ago, and I've been doing it ever since. And we just measured, there was another one of the golf pros I work with over here this morning. We were changing shafts in his driver. And we grabbed a head. He had a head with him that is getting a lot of PR this year about it being longer. Weighed 200 grams. I'll give you a hint. It's painted green.
Yeah, we know which one it is. Yeah.
So, fitting success comes from experimenting and trying different things and finding what works. So for the average golfer, years ago, I saw that lightweight heads work, and I only fit with heads where I can change weights.
Yeah. Well, let's segue into just a little bit. And, you and I talked before. You said, we'll probably get done in 30 minutes. I didn't expect it. And actually, Russ, I didn't want to because I knew we'd have a lot of good things to talk about. Talk a little bit about golf shaft reviews, okay? And people can get an incredible bargain. In fact, what is it, $10 a year to subscribe to it? But it's one of the best.
I just raised the price. It's $15 now.
Oh my God! Never mind. It's one of the best values out there for people that are serious about trying to understand golf shafts. I mean, if you're going to understand golf shafts, you should be looking at this.
Our discussion today has been all about understanding golf shafts, and Golf Shaft Reviews is a place where the golfer interested in golf shaft technology can go to learn. And when you look at the site, realize I don't take ads. That means that the articles aren't infomercials for a sponsor. And so when a golfer goes there and reads, he can learn about the complexity of today's golf shaft designs. And, just yesterday I got a phone call from a reader that drank the Kool-Aid. And he now understands what it is about some shafts that he's hit that feel good to him, and what it is about those that does not. And he was jumping to conclusions. He's saying, I know that I like the feel of that shaft, and I can see from looking at Golf Shaft Reviews that here's a shaft from another manufacturer that feels the same. What do you think about those two shafts? Which one should I use? And the same answer I always get, the one that fits.
Yeah.
So it's out there. The language of the golf shaft that I speak when I talk to a shaft designer or a shaft company executive is being explained in Golf Shaft Reviews. And, it's important when the golfer is seeking out a fitter for fitting him, that when he gets familiar with the language of golf shafts that I put in Golf Shaft Reviews, that he can talk to the fitter that he's going to do business with and evaluate how much that fitter understands the golf shaft and make a decision whether that's the fitter that he wants to work with.
Well, that really segues into the end, and this has been terrific. Everything I was hoping that you were going to talk about. Some final words for golfers who want to find the right custom fit for their driver shaft.
Find a good fitter, and part of that is find a guy that understands the core principles of human testing. I was lucky in college to get recruited and trained to work on several research projects that involved human testing in the psychology department. And I'm talking about the testing for PhD papers.
Yeah.
And the training protocol was rigorous, and you only moved one variable at a time. And I apply that kind of rigor when I fit. Golf club fitting has been promoted as an essential now for game improvement. And I absolutely agree that your swing is going to get shaped around your clubs. They're too heavy, it's going to throw you off. They're too light, you're not going to know where the head is. Sadly, the promotion of golf club fitting has been embraced by the companies that I would call club sellers as a step in the sales process.
Yeah.
And so we're at this position right now where, finding the right fit involves finding the right fitter. And you and I could have this discussion for days, right?
Well, it's always going to be, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But my advice to a golfer is to find a fitter that's willing to work for a fee and is willing to evaluate your current gear alongside of alternatives. And then if you really want to sort the wheat from the chaff, tell him that you can get your gear at cost from a professional friend, and you just want to know which you should order. Right?
Yeah.
And if he's still interested, then start asking questions about the technology he uses and the makeup of his fitting system. When you ask enough questions, you're going to be able to sort out a club fitter from a club seller.
And I know you have adopted those two phrases a lot lately, but I think that's great advice for people. Thanks.
There's fitting and there's selling.
Yeah. I'm not interested in being a seller.
Yeah.
And it's fun to see the results of great fitting too. So,
and it's fun to work with a guy that you can actually make a difference with.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of knowledge and experience that it takes to get to that point where you actually know what you're doing.
Yeah. And somebody in a store is not going to get that overnight.
They're not going to get it from a 1 or 2 hour training session from a factory rep.
Yeah.
And, so every day for a week they get a training session with a factory rep, and now they're a fitter.
Yeah. Well, we'll leave that for maybe another time, but there you go.
Yeah.
Well, Russ, I'm going to put links to your website and to Golf Shaft reviews. And if there's any links that you want me to put, for example, that describe your EI machine and things like that, send me a few things offline and I'll put that in the show notes. This was a fascinating discussion today. I'm glad you agreed to do it. It was. I think it's really good for golfers. I know the club fitters that we all walk around with will get some value out of it too, and good for everybody.
Well,
Tony, I enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
Taking your game to new heights. www.gameimprovementgolf.com.
Thanks, Russ, for that terrific interview. You have created a large amount of valuable resources for custom fitters and golfers, and I've included links to these in the show notes. To your Fit to Score website, to the Golf Shaft Review site, which is, in my view, well worth the $15 a year yearly subscription rate, and to your terrific Devoted Golfer YouTube channel, where you've posted all of those great YouTube videos that you've done with many of the leading people in the golf industry. A couple of things before we head out today. On April 4th, Des Mahoney and I are doing an open house at the Centennial Golf Academy in Oak Ridge at 7 p.m. And on April 8th from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m., I'm doing a Putting is Hard Day, also at the Centennial Golf Academy. Hope to see some of you at these events. Well, that's it for today. If you can't go to the First World Putting Conference, get a good friend and returnee to this podcast, Rob Gibb, to tell you about it because he was there. Rob is the Science in Motion Sports U.S. representative and the Level 3 SAM putting instructor. And I'm really delighted he'll talk to me about this event and what he learned there. See you in 2 weeks.
Game Improvement Golf, your source of information and inspiration to become an exceptional golfer now. www.gameimprovementgolf.com